the blog, I don't know how to use the comments on the blog because it's only a few. I don't know if anybody else reads it. There's a bit of tension about how long we spend on the review, but I'd like to see us completing the review and moving into applying it to adolescents today. On the other hand, if you feel that concept that you don't understand well enough to use, the point of the review is to give us a conceptual basis that we're going to be using from now on. So questions are in order, but mainly questions about, do I understand this enough? The questions about whether this is true or not are very deep questions, but we're not going to solve them here. So we're sort of being more practical about can we use the concepts, how they were discovered, what other concepts there are. That's an important discussion, but not for the review. So we moved last time from multiple meetings. Remember that we wanted to see that everything has everything that goes on, including whatever fell, has a personal meaning and a family meeting. We won't ask what the family meeting is, and a group meeting. And now we're talking about the development of self, and the main point that we talked about in terms of development of self is what's known as the self-object. The point of the self-object is that what we call the self is actually an interactional process. That's the most important thing. And in an interactional process, the other has different roles towards the self. The main two roles that we talked about were the mother's or another person's self-regulating self-object, and then intersubjective self-object. I hope these terms are feeling familiar. The self-regulating self-object is the one who does things and directs me, and then I feel regulated, I feel safe and comfortable. I can't do it for myself, so the person does it for me, but it feels like it comes from in me. And the intersubjective self-object is the other who shares, in the case of the baby, mother's own self. It's not a matter of what mother wants to happen to the baby. It's what the mother shares of her own self. The baby learns, oh, there's a self, I can do that too. There's a subject, I can be a subject too. That's why it's called intersubjective. And that's why we say that the first subject is the other, which is a complete reversal of what we used to. We used to thinking that I grow just from inside of me, and then I open my eyes and find other people. And this way of looking at it, which is the dominant way of looking at it now, is that my subjectivity is informed and enhanced and actually facilitated by the subjectivity of the other person when they share their subjectivity with me. So when mother says, look, I see outside there's a tree, she's doing something extremely profound, which is communicating something from her inside that the baby can now understand, and then the baby can then say, wow, I could also see a tree and communicate that. That makes me a subject, right? You can see how that works in families. We'll get to differentiation in a moment, but you can see how in families there's always a fear that the family is going to take me over and not let me be myself. That's the dominant Western way of looking at families, that you've got to get rid of them. We'll see in a minute that view is a distortion of adolescence. The idea comes from adolescence. Whereas if you look more closely, you see that that's part of the story. Everything is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The other part of the story is that you need your people to be able to continue to grow as a self. And that's the real, in families with higher differentiation, that's where families come in. Families help each individual to become themselves. Now that's the turning point here in learning about family therapy. That when you sit in a room with a bunch of people in a family, you say to yourself not who is each individual and how each person is impacting negatively on the other individual. You're also looking at how each person is helping the other individual in an intersubjective way, how people are able to create new relationships you create face-to-face. You don't do it inside your pulpit. You think about it inside your pulpit. You may prepare it inside your pulpit. You do it face to face with others. So the intersubjective self-object is the transition, really, to working with the relationship between people. So far, so good? Okay. So then, now that we got through that, just working people are thought. I wonder. Then, when we went on to talk about differentiation, in a word, if you recall, Bowen was a 50-year-old white American male when he discovered that he knew nothing about relationships. Now, back in those days, no white American male knew anything about relationships. But Bowen was the first one who noticed it. And he noticed it by realizing that when he would walk into his office, which he was running, he felt that he would become constricted. What does that mean, constricted? That he had less degrees of freedom, less places where he could express himself. He had kind of a role, but he was restricted in that role. He couldn't change it. And the role was, I don't know, the boss that everybody thinks knows more than he really knows. So he began to think that maybe that comes from his family of origin. And maybe in his family of origin, he had this role as the all-knowing, bright firstborn, and that he needed to change that role in his family of origin. Now, why would he have to change his role in his family of origin? He could just think about it. He had an insight, right? So if he had his insight, that should be enough. Wrong. That's exactly where Bowen became a family therapist. He said, I know this. I know this actually for probably about 15, 20 years. But when I go home, nothing changes. When I walk into my office where I created all these relationships, nothing changes. So I think I have to do something with my family. Now, how many of you have read Bowen's paper on his work with his own family? Oh, good, okay. So, and the other half, now's the time. So he said, I can recreate myself with my family, because that's where I created myself. Created both in the expanding way and in the limiting way. That's where I became Murray Bowen. When I was 18, I was the firstborn. I knew everything. And since then, every time I go home, everybody expects that I'm going to explain everything to everybody. So I'm going home and knowing nothing and making trouble. And we're going to have what he called the tempest in a teapot. He created a crisis over nothing. And refused to do his usual shtick, which meant, as he describes it, you go home for Shabbos. He wasn't Jewish, but you go home for a family, whatever, and for 20 minutes, you do not do what you usually do. Familiar to you? You know, you feel, everybody sits down, you know who does what, who opens, who, so whatever it is that you usually do, you don't do it for 20 minutes, and then everything starts to be different, like you're all in fog, vis-a-vis today's weather. You're in fog. You used to think the landscape was clear, but now it's in fog, and you're going to have to recreate the relationships based on who people are now. You see how that connects to intersubjective? In other words, Bowen said, I can be subjective and have an insight and think that I can change who I am, but when I go home, it doesn't work. And when I go to work, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because who I am is connected to all these other self-objects. And their being a self-object depends on who I am. So we end up going into the same old. In other words, it's the same play. The only way to change the play is face-to-face with your people. So that's where the intersubjective comes in. Now, if you think about Bowen before the tempest in the teapot, what was he describing? He referred to it as a family with lower differentiation, right? So differentiation, as you probably by now remember, he delineated two aspects of it. One is that you start from what he called the I position. Hopefully we're Familiar with that? It's like the ballet position, the first position, second position. It's where from where you start communicating. And the start of communication is from, in a higher differentiated form, from who you really are, from what you really feel. Say, look, you know, when I sit with you people, I don't feel comfortable having to know everything. Something that Bowen was never able to say, right? So that would be an I position. People start from their I position. What's a non-I position? He doesn't describe it. What's a non-I position? He's playing the game, right? And saying, okay, what do I expect of you? What do you expect of me, right? So that limits the communication. People start from, how are we going to get through this? Now, the word how we're going to get through this, does that sound like the self-regulation? You see, lower differentiation, people are doing regulation. They're doing something. They're protecting the system as it is. Everybody feels happy. Everybody knows their role, but nothing can change. So there's a human dilemma in groups, which is that people tend to protect it as it is, and then things have to change because, you know, Bowen's 50 and nothing's changed since he was 18. It's a piece of life. So when things need to change, then you have to upset the regulation, and that's where you get anxiety and fear. But what that does is it allows the differentiation to rise for everybody. How does it rise for everybody? Because everybody is freed from self-regulating, and everybody's invited into the workshop of self-creation, of the intersubjective self-object. In other words, I can't say to other people, look, stop doing this. Bowen had done that for a while, and his family said, oh, great, Murray, he's a psychiatry professor. He knows what we should do. And he said, oh, this isn't working. If I tell them what to do, I'm back in my own role, so I'm going to have to come in doing nothing. What does that do to other people? It frees them to say, ah, you're a different Murray. I'm also a different sister, a different brother. We can change, we can create in an intersubjective way. And if you remember the very moving end of the article, where he takes this trip with his father to the area, you know, he was much stuck into his mother's family of origin. That's where the family business was. That's where they buried people out there. And he didn't know much about his father. He took a trip with his father, and he said at the age of about 50, I finally know what a real relationship is. Well, what does that mean? I finally know what a real relationship is. It means that we freed ourselves from regulation. Regulation was staying in the same roles, and allowed each other to start from an I position, not triangulate the second brother or mother into it, and create something. So that's the third part. The first is I position, second is not triangulating, and the third part is that we allow for intersubjective self-object recreating. That's the connection with the self-object, okay? So that's what we try to do in family therapy. All of family therapy is based on seeing people together and saying to ourselves, are they regulated enough to be able to do some new creation? If they're not regulated enough, we need to help them become secure. Perhaps with us, they may need to do what they're used to doing even more. But when they're at a point where they want to enter into intersubjective self-object recreating, so then we encourage them. We say, you have something to gain from it. Do you have anything to lose from it? Oh, yeah. Sure you have something to lose from it. You lose the security of knowing how it's always been, right? What do you have to gain? Freedom. But it's not just freedom, you know, in the American sense that everybody should not care who anybody else is. It's freedom in the sense that you're able to create with self-objects who create with you, on the assumption that people do creation, people grow face-to-face. And the main place where they grow face-to-face is with their people. And that will happen in the family therapy room when people are ready and when the therapist sees that happening and assists it. Relevant questions to applications, yeah.
Do you mind giving an example of like someone coming in where you work on the regulating and then
Well, let's say, you know, parents come in and say about their 14-year-old boy, he's not acting right. He seems to say he doesn't like to go to school, and his teachers don't I don't think he's really learning too much. He seems to be depressed. And the two parents are equally concerned about the boy. And they're not talking about their relationship, right? And so the therapist could say, okay, let's send him to a child psychiatrist and give him God knows what, and get him back to function. Or that would be regulation. All medication is regulation, right? Well, that's the advantage of it, and that's the disadvantage of it if it doesn't fit in peace and creation. Or they can say, you know, how well do you think you understand your boy? And the two of them say, oh, we understand him fine. So, oh, that's wonderful. How do you understand him so well? Well, we just know. Well, you know, when was the last time he told you what he thought about the people sitting next to him in class? And the answer is second grade. Okay. Do you think it's the same at 14 as it is in second grade? Well, why not? Well, let's give it a try. Would it be okay, you ask the, let's say the father, would it be okay if you ask him what goes on? And the mother says, that's not necessary, we know. In other words, she and the father want to stay on the same regulation, that we are the parents who know things. And you help her to say, well, there might be something new that could happen. Would it be okay? That's a very honest question. Would it be okay? And if the answer is no, that wouldn't be okay. This is how we do things. So, let's get back to regulation, right? Keep it as it is. Parents want to send the kid to a psychiatrist. Or if she says, would it be okay? Or if you encourage her, say, how about if we give it a try and see if the sky falls or not? If it starts to fall, we'll pick it up and we'll do something else. But would it be okay? And she says, I don't get the question. Of course it's okay. You say to yourself, you don't know what's in for you, but let's give it a try. So then the father starts to mumble to the boy, and the boy starts to cry. And the father says to the mother, why is he crying? And you say to the mother, you know what, triangles? How about if you see if dad can solve this with his son? Let's give it a try. Because otherwise they're going to go back to a triangle, right? And so the mother agrees. And you say to the father, you know something, before you ask him what goes on for him, does he know what you were like when you were 14? Intersubjective, non-regulatory. There's nothing when you say what I was like when I was 14. You're not expecting anything from it. You're saying, I see a tree, right? Do you think he has an idea of what went on when you were 14? And the boy starts to wiggle, and you say, you have something to say. He said, well, I asked his parents. Never mind. You don't want to know about that. Oh, in other words, the kid was curious about his father, but he couldn't talk to him directly. That's what grandparents and uncles and aunts are for, by the way, to get an expanded view of your parents, you know, the expanded view. So you say to the father, how about, we're going to get to how he gets up in the morning, because, you know, they come in and say, how do we get him up in the morning, which is a regulatory issue. Huh? I say, we're going to get to that, but let's take a couple of minutes. Would it be okay if you tell him what you were like when you were 14? So the mother says, I'm not sure that this is really what we're here for. That's a perfectly acceptable regulatory statement, like it's a way of saying, well, something's going to change, because this conversation has never happened before, and now it's happening. So there's something new, right? And you help the mother to say, well, if the two of them aren't plutzing, then let's give it a try. There may be something very important that could happen. You stay with I positions, detriangulate, and go for co-creation, okay? So then the father starts to cry and says, I'm not sure that this is going to be helpful for you to know this, he says to his son. And the therapist says, let's give it a try. It may be more helpful than you think. But you sit with the father and you help, support him, because he's about to go and take a risk, right? So you're supporting both parents that are taking a risk of loss of regulation. And say, he said, I ran away from home when I was 14. Okay. So staying in bed, it turns out, is a way of not running away from home, right? It's what we would call a tikkun. In other words, the previous generation home was impossible. The boy is trying to stay at home, but he can't both be at school and stay at home. So we have a moment of regulation here. does that give you an example?
Yeah.
Is that concrete enough? You see, these are things that people do in family therapy. I'm not making this up, right? But the question is why we do it and what informs it. So when you see that sort of a thing, you say to yourself, what's in the mind of the therapist? And we'll see, as we see the other systems, lots of things could be in the mind of the therapist. What I would like to be in the mind of you as therapists is where is the risk of loss of regulation and where is the opportunity for co-creation? Because even for an adolescent to change the self, that's face-to-face. That's a co-creation with other people. Just one second. Right.
How do you see that the family is regulated as a therapist? Like, what are the signs?
The mother says, I don't think we want to do that. His Rebbe said this, and his Rebbe said that, and we have to get him. If he doesn't go to school tomorrow morning, they're going to throw him out. And so this conversation will have to wait. So they want to know how to get him up in the morning. That's regulation. That's not intersubjective, right?
And they don't want to really hear from him.
They're not yet. See, that would be the usual way of saying it. So, well, they have this lousy differentiation. Bowen, unfortunately, talked about high differentiation, which he really liked, but he didn't give credit to what people are doing in low differentiation. Low differentiation people are protecting themselves. They're not doing something bad. They're protecting something that's not working. It's not working, but they're protecting because they're sure that it could only be worse, right?
How would you know as a therapist in 1 second? So now they're regulated enough so I can...
So the kid runs out of the room. Mother says, I don't think we can do that. The kid runs out of the room. So now you have to go back to regulation. So you say to yourself, this family at this moment is not ready to take an intersubjective risk. And so we're going to have to deal with regulation, and we'll talk about how to deal with regulation as we get further. But we're going to have to deal with regulation because they're not yet ready for. I push them beyond what's right for them right now. But you say to yourself, after the kid goes to school, we're going to do this again, right? It's just that they have to be better regulated, less frightened, before they can have this conversation. But I'm reminding myself that this boy and his father need to have a conversation. Maybe it'll take a month, and maybe it'll take 2 years, and God knows what else needs to be pulled into it. But if you want people to grow, they need to have that conversation at some point. Huh?
If you hold low differentiation, in a low differentiated family, regulation means that everyone has its place and this is how we do things and we don't make ourselves have anxieties. But if there is anxiety anyway underlying, and the family is low differentiated, but people are in pain, is it still called regulated?
Right. So you see there's two kinds of anxiety out there. I don't know if you know this. There's two systems of anxiety. One is what's called an alerting anxiety. It wakes us up and it makes us better. We see something that's struggling and it makes us, go do something new. And then there's overwhelming anxiety. It's a different physiological system. And if a family is in overwhelming anxiety, they need to get back to the feet on the ground, right? And therapists are always running the risk of pushing people beyond what they can do. That's one of the places where we're dangerous. So we take small risks, but we say, you see, the language that I said to the mother was, how about if we try it, and if the sky starts to fall, we'll pick it up and do something different. Because the sky might start to fall. In other words, that there may be anxiety, which is not alerting, but overwhelming, and they need to get back to motivation. So we need to know how to continue with that, instead of saying, you people are untreatable, which is what family therapists used to do with patients like that. They would say, you people are untreatable, instead of, I'm not using the right treatment system. See, overall, we would like to say that no patient fails. The people who fail are us. We don't get it, we didn't understand it, we did something that wasn't right, we didn't have the right chemistry, we could fail. Clients can't fail. They can't afford to fail. So you say, we'll do some regulation. How we do regulation, we haven't gotten to that yet. We're going to get to that.
So we're talking about like people who are low differentiated families relative. It can't be that the people are highly differentiated and have good intersubjectivity and their kids know what they were like as a kid.
Right. But Bowen liked to say to himself for 30 years, I'm okay, they're not. Right? And every adolescent, or every common, non-therapized adolescent, says as they leave adolescence, I'm a hell of a lot better than they are. Right? In other words, because adolescents, when they discover something, the first thing they assume is that no one else has ever discovered it. That's how adolescents think. So I'm a lot better than them, and that's why I need to break off from them, because the more I have to do with them, the more they pull me down. That tends to be a myth. Now, we're not talking about absolutes, right? There may be people in this room for whom that is true, right? But as a therapist, you question it. You don't deny it, but you question it. That's what we do about everything. You say, maybe the way that you're seeing yourself is so differentiated includes a cutoff from your family. It includes the fact that you're the one who can't have any contact with them. And differentiation is something that people do together. Creation is something that people do together. Now, the theory that, one person is well and everybody else is nuts that's the basis of mental health thinking. What we're doing is expanding that. We're questioning it. We're saying maybe it's what Bowen referred to as a cutoff. A cutoff is not a sign of differentiation. There are two signs of low differentiation, if you recall. One is that you can't separate from mom for 15 minutes. And the other is that you can't stand to be with her for 15 minutes, right? So one is what's called the undifferentiated ego mass. So in Minuchin's terms, it's enmeshed families. And the other is that you can't, it's what's called cutoff, or Minuchin incorrectly called disengaged. The way the family system is that people don't talk to each other. What Bowen was trying to say is, I tried that, and that doesn't work. That's what he did. He said, it doesn't work. There's better than that. And that involves going back and doing recreation. Now, is that an absolute truth? You see, we're over here, we're at the feet on the ground. We don't know about absolute truths. Is it possible that it could be different? Everything is possible. Is it a useful way to think? That's why we're talking about applications. Right? Is it a useful way to think that if let's say you have a seminary girl that you're treating, who says, "Oh, you don't want to know about my family. I'm not going back. I'm staying. I'm in seminary, but I'm not going back. And they're going to have a fight with me, but I'm not going back because I can't bear to talk with them." Right? So it could be that that moment in development, that's what's important for her. But we question it. We say, well, a cutoff is not necessary. Maybe it's a regulation. Cutting off is a regulation. No contact. But there's more to go than that. If you want, I'll give you a more extreme example. I once, about 35 years ago, I saw a 16-year-old girl in the hospital who made a suicide attempt, and she was in therapy, and she couldn't bear to have her parents know about the therapy. In those days, a 16-year-old was on the border, and it was quasi-legal, and she said, if my parent, I can't, no contact with my parents, this therapy is for me. What does the therapist do? Does the therapist say, yes, you're absolutely right, whatever you think about your parent is right? Or does the therapist say, I have to tell you how I think about it, because I'm a little older than you. If that's what you need for now, we will accept it, and we will work with it. But I hope for you that as things go ahead, it will become possible to engage in your family, with your family as well, because I don't want you to live all alone in the world. But that's just how I think. You have your world, I have my world, you see? And that's so, but that's part of differentiation in therapy, that you don't buy what a client says as the only way that things can be. You say, well, you decide how we start, but I continue to think, and these days we call it transparency, I'll tell you how I think. That the more that you can afford to have some contact at some point when it's right for you with your family, I think it's probably better for you. And then you say to yourself in parentheses, because self-creation needs intersubjective self-objects, and your intersubjective self-objects, in growing up were your parents, and you can co-create with them better than with anybody else if it's possible. That you don't say to clients, but that's the thing we're trying to say to ourselves. Okay? So then, we just stitch in, for those of you who like to stitch it in, it's not required. We stitched in Martin Buber here, right? Because we said, well, wait a minute. Where does that idea come from? That co-creation, this idea of face-to-face, the idea that the subject is really intersubjective, the fact that face-to-face meetings with people are really where creation takes place. Well, it so happens that happens to be the theory that was developed a long, long time ago by Martin Buber. And so we also can refer to those co-creational events as I-thou moments, as moments when you say second person instead of third person. And you'll see in families, we're about to get to the Minuchin system. Minuchin says here, talk to each other, right? Now, Minuchin says, oh, I'm making the co-system, I'm dealing with the subsystem, and I'm putting boundaries around the subsystem, blah, blah, blah. But what's going on in the between a father and son, for example? The example they just gave, that's how Minuchin talks. What is going to happen between the father and the son? The function of the subsystem. What is a function of a subsystem, of two people in a family? It's intersubjective creation, if at all possible. That's what we strive for. That corresponds to the I-thou moments, the second person moments that Buber described as central to human experience. The one thing that we would add in by talking with Buber is that there's always the risk that the therapist is schlepping in a whole value system that is his and not the family's. You say this is how people ought to be. So when Bowen talked about high differentiation, low differentiation, a little bit guilty of it, right? He says, well, I think families should have high differentiation. And the obvious question is, Favos, how do you know that that's better for people? How do you know it's better for a community? What makes you think that differentiation is a good thing? Maybe regulation is a good thing. Maybe communities survive better with regulation. Why do you have to, what's this whole business about differentiation? You see, before Bowen, it was a good question because it was all about individuation. It was all about becoming yourself, right? And so then you would ask the question, what's this whole business about becoming yourself? People live in relationships. Women ask that question, of that way of looking at it. But you see, Bowen is talking about living in relationships. He's talking about procreating. He's talking about not the self as cut off from other people, but the self as co-created. And then you say to yourself, okay, but Favos, who says that that's a good thing? So then if you import Buber as a different kind of observation or understanding, he says, well, that's when people feel alive. That's when people feel that they're their own selves, because your whole self speaks to another whole self. When you say second person, you're also bringing in a complete I, or at least a more complete I. And when you're not doing that, your I is limited. You could call it it's being regulated. You could call it you're just living what you've already had. But to actually expand yourself, to become yourself, you need those moments of I-you. And that happens in groups. And that actually distinguishes the health of a group, right? So then you would stitch together Bowen and Buber, who never met each other. They close miss, but they didn't. It would have been good for Bowen. It would have been irrelevant to Buber. Buber was so old that he wasn't into learning new things at the time. But it wouldn't have been bad for Bowen. You say, okay, so what I'm doing for this family is trying to wish for them better life. That's better life together, because that's what human beings need. Now, if you take Buber out of it and say, who says that people need that? People want to, just hear what to do with each other, or regulate, or hang out, and that isn't part of human life. If you take Buber out of it, you don't really have any good reason to be doing family therapy, do you? You say, well, differentiation, differentiation, who needs it? Why is it of value? If you put Buber in, it becomes clearer that and when you have those moments, you see, if you take the example we gave before, when instead of leaving the room, the father says to the boy, when I was 18, I left home, and the boy hugs his father and says, I'm not going to leave you, right? Now, those are moments that happen in family therapy. I wish them for all of you. When you see it the first time, you say to yourself, this isn't imagination here. This isn't theory. This is life. Something is happening with this boy and his father addressing themselves in second person. That is, something is happening here that has never happened before. And if you look back, it may be not for the last 60 years. So you're in one of those moments where you say, oh, I guess I'll stay as a family therapist. It seems like This is deeply moving. And you see, when that happens, by the way, that the mother also cries. And says to her husband, I'm so glad you could tell him that. I didn't think it was possible. I thought you would plutz. And he says, and I thought you would plutz. Because everybody thinks everybody's plutzing. That's regulation, right? The anti-plutzing theory. So,
But if the kid's gonna plot, but the parents wouldn't, but they're just too scared to tell the kid.
say that again?
But if the parents are strong enough, but they don't think the kid is.
That's regulation. But then the kid says, the kid is strong enough. The kid hugs his father and says, I'm not leaving you. Now they have a lot to work out. But something has happened that if you say to yourself, is this against anything? What could this possibly be against? But it's something that you created as a gift for the family. And then you say to yourself, is it worth thinking about it? I don't know. You know, every family therapist has a different way of saying it. Family therapists like to say there are magic moments. But magic is a way of saying, I prefer not to understand it. I prefer to leave it in some sort of imaginary realm. But those are the moments that keep people as family therapists. And when it happens to the therapist face-to-face with a client, when you feel that a client is saying that to you, or you're saying it to them, and something different happens. So you say that's what makes it worth being a therapist. Do you need to conceptualize it? In this room, you need to conceptualize it. That's what we're doing here, right? We're trying to allow ourselves to expand our thinking to encompass as much as possible, which is 10% of what really goes on. 10% is better than 9%. 11% is probably impossible. Yeah.
So it's very beautiful. I wish it would happen a lot, that families come in and really do this work. I wish we'll get there, because my question is, what do we do? Have a lot of individuals who come in because the families don't want to come, the spouse doesn't want to come, and like with this teenager that you were dealing with, so you were helping her become more differentiated.
Right.
She doesn't want to go back to her family. Why? She doesn't feel safe. Maybe one of her parents has a personality disorder or whatever, so she can't go and bring back and do this work with her family or with her parents.
Right.
So what do you do then?
Well, first of all, you say to yourself, maybe personality disorder is a useless way of thinking, and that maybe if I met her mother, I would find that this is a tortured individual who is frightened and just trying to keep things as they are. But it has more to do with what you wish for yourself and for the therapy. I think I mentioned to you that the working model of the patient has to be better than the patient's model of himself. Right? In other words, what people think of themselves, so it's true of their families too. In other words, if somebody comes in and says, I'm okay, they're no good, and you say to yourself, we'll see. I would hope for you that we can find something different, but it takes time. How you do that, that's what supervision is about, not in here. But to enter into the statement, I would hope you and your mother could find an IU moment. And if you can't with your mother, let's just figure out when you can get to it with your daughter. So you're 16, so it'll be 10 years from now. Say that. Life takes time. But you say to yourself, staying in low differentiation is a tragedy. It's not fun. It's a tragedy for everybody. So, but as Bowen would say, it takes 3 generations to heal. Who, if not us, knows that about the Holocaust? It takes 3 generations to heal from a massive trauma. And so the people on the way are called personality disorders and this and that. Dina?
I'm just wondering, what is a response to what Razi is saying, to be that Bowen never brought his whole family into a therapist's office, but he went into his family with his own thoughts, ideas, ways that he wanted to interact differently, and that created change. And I think that's part of our mission when we're working with an individual and we can't conscript the rest of the family to come into the office, but the belief that this person can take our directives and they can go home different. And by going home differently, they can create different conversations, different interactions.
And they come back to the office wounded, and you talk about it, and they go back again, and maybe 5 years before you get to it. But you think about it. This is about thinking about it. Yeah.
I feel it's such, what we do with planning this way is very dependent on who and who is it?
If I can't hear you, it may be my problem, but it may be difficult over there too, so just a little louder.
No, I'm just wondering about the success of feeling like this. Sometimes it works because the family is somewhat receptive or you can push them, but sometimes there's families where, as Reggie says, like narcissistic personality in there or something, which is really hard to impact in such a way. And the opposite, when someone goes home or brings us home, it's threatening to that person at home. And co-creation might not happen so easily.
Co-creation does
Or-
not happen easily. The thing that I gave as an
Saying it's less
example.
successful than-
What?
It can be less successful than a family that's more...
Right, so then you say to yourself, how is this family going to raise its level of differentiation over generations? Over generations. One of the advantages that I have of sitting in the same place for 35 years is seeing that. If you stay in the same place and you watch families grow, you see that what you couldn't do for an adolescent with his parents, you can now do for him with his adolescent kids. So you need a lot of patience, but we're talking about how to think about it, not how to do it. And so sometimes what you need to do in therapy is this is not the time. This is not the right time to do anything except better regulation. About all the therapies about regulation we're going to get to, but we first need to know how to think about them. Yeah.
I want to reflect back and understood correctly. What you were saying is that personality disorders is therapists' way of regulating the overwhelming fears that the clients bring.
Except for, instead of saying is, you might say could be. In other words, it's a way of adding some thinking to it. In other words, see, this isn't a course on psychopathology. We're going to do psychopathology in the first semester of the third year, and when we do it, you're going to have a course about psychopathology, and parallel to it, I'm going to talk with you about low differentiated families, and we're going to try to work on that particular issue. So, patience, not 3 generations, but a little bit of patience, yeah. So,
Just to clarify, when we have a patient, let's say like the seminary girl,
when we what?
let's take the example of the seminary girl.
Yeah.
We're not saying that a high differentiation is going to look necessarily the same for her as in another family that's quote-unquote high differentiation. Meaning sometimes there are difficult personalities in the family that are really damaging to the children, and they are technically destroying the children.
Right.
Just because the child is doing work doesn't mean the person at home is going to stop trying to destroy them.
Right.
There could be a way they interact together in a way that would take many years for that girl to go back and be able to talk to the mother, but it doesn't mean she's going to have much contact past whatever is healthy.
Right.
So we could call it high differentiation, but for a different family it would be very low differentiation.
Then what?
Meaning for her it works because that doesn't mean that they're all of a sudden going to have like this beautiful relationship ever.
Dina wants to say something.
Co-creation, not differentiation.
When Dina is kicking in, we know we're in the clinical conversation, and that means to me that we'll try to limit it so we can stay with the theory, because this is what we're here for 3 years to learn. But go ahead. No. After you talk, I'll limit it.
I was just thinking about Lydia's comment, Sarah's comment, and thinking that if we would stretch what co-creation could mean for an individual client, it could mean that they could go home to this dysfunctional, not able at this stage in their lives to engage with my desire to change the relationship. But if I'm coming in changed, either it's my expectation or the way I don't contribute to escalating situations, then on a certain level I've created some change unilaterally that affects the system.
Good. Okay. So now, let me just say a word about adolescence, because that's what we're going to be talking about. So you can see that, yeah.
Sorry, Len. On the psychopathology point about, say, a personality disorder or something. So the way I'm understanding when you're saying that it's useless, meaning that it's like magic. It's like this person's got X, and I don't have to study him or his relationships anymore. Kind of leave it at that. Is that what?
Am I saying what?
Meaning that the point of
I doubt I'm saying that, but I don't know what it was.
I mean that the issue of that the issue of kind of leaving a label on a person without really, kind of prevents you from going in closer. It's kind of like the word you used magic before, that kind of lets you put something over there and then you really don't have to delve into the relationship or to the individual per se.
Right. So look, in a word, because you all want to make sure that you don't have a personality disorder, right? That's what comes up when you mention pathology. That's what happens in medical school. People go home every single day with a different disease. So, and the guy who's the doctor for the medical students klutzes. But, he gets the idea that, okay, somebody comes in saying, oh, it's hurting me right here. He said, what lecture did you hear yesterday? The idea of a personality disorder is essentially the same as a neurosis with a very slow rate of change. In other words, the idea of a personality disorder, if you think about it dynamically, in other words, personality disorders came from the Freudian way of looking at it. So they were conflicts, and they're not so resolvable. And at some point, the person says, "I'm not changing this. I'm gonna always act this way towards everybody, right?" And that keeps. But you see that it's a kind of a regulation, and the price of it is that people with personality disorders, it's a little hard to talk to them because they're always putting you into their drama. But you say to yourself, "Is it frozen?" Oh, we're dealing with human beings. Personality disorders are not frozen. And if you say to yourself, okay, if you look just at the person, they would prefer for you to see them as frozen. See, a personality disorder person comes in and says, hello, doctor, I'm not changing. Right? That's the calling card. I'm here and I'm not here to change. Can you get this one off my back? Can you get that one off my back? I'm fine. So you say to yourself, this is a tragedy. It's a person that doesn't believe they can change. And if you schlep in all of our theory up until now, you say, why would a person not believe that they can change? Because they're involved in regulation all the time, inside of themselves and with everybody else, and they have only regulatory or I-it experiences in the world, and no one's spoken to them in a way that ignites the possibility of some change. And so when you're talking with somebody who is just, wants to convince you that they have something inside that can't change, and you go back with them to when they decided that, which is usually adolescence, right? And when they decided that you can't trust people, for example, right? So it's called it a paranoid personality disorder. Somebody says you can't trust people, and you say to yourself, what a tragedy not to be able to trust people. But you must have had good reason to think about that at some point. And they tell you what the good reasons were. When I was in 10th grade, everybody was against me, and the teacher also thought that I was a loser, and my parents at the time divorced, and so this was a safer way to be. And you say, that must have been one of the worst moments of your life. You say you, right? And so that's what Dina was talking about. In other words, when you introduce the IU, where do you introduce the IU with people with so-called personality disorders? In the room. That's what the room is about. And every system of psychotherapy ultimately gets to that same point, where you change the way of talking, and instead of saying, if you could, I think you should learn to trust people. Or let's say you have a cognition, why don't you change it? And say that, that helps one person and I don't know how many. But you get to the point of saying, that you needed to do, that was crucial for you. And I'm just trying to imagine what a horrible moment that was for you in your life, when that's how you had to, save yourself from sinking and being overwhelmed by everybody. And if you can do it within a relationship, and the relationship feels like the person say, oh, are you saying you? Is that what you're saying? You're saying you, and you're bringing yourself. Aren't you a therapist who's supposed to be looking at me like a rat and figuring out what's the matter? Are you bringing yourself to this? And so that's when things change, because you reignite what Buber would say is the core of human existence, which everybody has experienced at some point, and then people give up on. So that's a different way of looking at it. Does that help you with the personality disorders? You're going to have to learn about all the personality disorders, but you don't have to believe everything you learn. You don't have to believe what you're learning here either. Yeah.
Question. What you're saying is very interesting to me, like as a psychiatrist. I mean,
Right.
you prescribe medication, and it's hard for me to believe that everyone has had a backstory that needs to be worked out. I mean, sometimes these illnesses are just illnesses that need medication.
But when you think that your client doesn't have a backstory, transfer the client.
No, I'm not saying this.
No, I'm serious.
Yeah.
In other words, that's what psychiatrists do all the time, but they don't get anywhere with it. But we're talking about therapy. We're not talking about the side disciplines like psychiatry, which live in I-IT. DSM-5 is a book of I-IT. So that's an interesting book of I-IT, but it's a book of I-IT. So when you think as a therapist that you have nothing more to say because this is just stuck the way it is, see if somebody else can see it differently. I'm serious, because psychiatrists will encourage you to give up on your patients. That's what we're here for, right? It's good business. And you send a guy to a woman to a psychiatrist, and he says she's borderline. And you say, oh, good, so I don't have to do anything, right? Because who can treat a borderline? So that's not a very useful discourse. But if the psychiatrist says, look, this medication might do this, but there's a backstory, stay with it. And as a matter of fact, if I give her this or that little pill, she may be able to get closer to her backstory. That's the reason to use medication. Not to keep you further from her, to keep you closer, to allow her to get closer to you, to say, this is now alerting anxiety and not overwhelming anxiety. So-called borderline people are traumatized. And so the overwhelming anxiety comes up all the time, and they do what they do, which is usually pretty obnoxious if they're borderline. If they're less obnoxious, they do other things. But, the term borderline, for example, when it came up in the 80s, remember, anybody know that there were once in the 70s and the 80s? In New York, you never said borderline. You said borderline. And that meant you hated your patient. And then the treatment, which is fine, you can hate your patient, but then you got to work on it, right? If you can't hate your patient, you can't love them. You have to be there, right? But the idea is not to get stuck. In other words, the so-called Bible, DSM-4 or 5, that's something worth knowing about. As they say, know your enemy. That's the enemy of therapy, but you have to know it.
I just feel like you have to choose sides here, and if you're going in the therapeutic way, you have to basically say, like, these things exist, but it's not really anxiety, it's a backstory, or it's not really borderline.
No, you don't say it's not. You say it's not only.
No.
The word only is not a useful term in any discourse whatsoever. Freud thought it was such a useless term that he used it as a sort of a joking way. It's the same as in Yiddish, nur. And Freud uses nur all the time. But he knows that nobody's taking it seriously. And actually, it's a quote from Sherlock Holmes. In other words, the idea was that you could say, you see this total mess? Oh, it's only, a neurosis. And then things fall into shape. But he didn't mean only in that way, in the other way. The word only is not a useful term. And what we're trying to do here is not to take away personality disorders. You can have all of them if you want, right? But not only personality disorders. In other words, a person walks in and they may have what somebody would, it fits all the criteria while a person comes right out of the book. And then you say, and who is this person? Who is an irreducible individual, usually with a story, right? Do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, just Miriam, I think it used to be more opposing views, like you had the medical, biological, pharmaceutical companies versus the therapeutic stance, and now there's been more a bridge, at least what I've learned, in terms of the neurobiology and attachment, because they're seeing how relational processes are influencing biology, and they can take scans of it, and once you can see that, then you can go back to challenge the diagnosis and see how it's relational based. And yes, it could be more rigid, like if somebody has a lower level diagnosis, that means you just have to work slower, but it doesn't mean that they're labeled fully. And also there is a DSM, I don't know the exact name of it, but it's like a psychodynamic DSM, where it takes diagnosis and it brings it back to the possibility of how it was, how somebody came to that.
Yeah, I heard that.
Right.
But labeling is limiting and diagnosis is controversial.
Label is only a way of making order where there's disorder, but it's no more than that. It's useful because it helps you to sit in the room, but it's not exhaustive. Labeling is not exhaustive. There is no system that's exhaustive. So we're just trying to add another one to keep you on your toes.
Can't it be regulating for some, like the chaos and lack of order, and then they find the label and find it reassuring, regulating?
But, you could say that
They don't
labels are regulated. Let's try to go on because I do want to get to. So we did differentiation. Now, I saw that when I suggested in the Tawgil that you refer to some complementary cycle, that a few people said, what? What's a complementary cycle? So that's why we tape these lectures. And I don't want to repeat that whole lecture now, but it is your responsibility to know what a complementary cycle is. In other words, at this point in the game, if you don't, go back over the lecture, go back over the reading. I'll say it in a couple of words, but if you didn't know it before, you're not going to know it from these words. It's just going to help you to try to go to it. The complementary cycle is a form of regulation in dyads, right? It's a form of regulation. It's a form of regulation in which the anxiety or the low self-esteem flips between one and the other, right? And if you listen to it inside, if you recall John and Eleanor, that Eleanor says, whenever I talk to John, he runs away from me. So that sounds like a linear statement. And we created a cycle about it, because we said that when Eleanor speaks to John, she wants to believe that it's possible to have someone listen to her, right? So then she's doing okay, but he's not doing okay. So he moves away from her, then she's not doing okay, but he's doing okay. Why? They, like a complementary couple, have fears that are complementary. His fear is, I'm going to be engulfed. Her fear is, I'm going to be left alone. Does this remind you of Bowen? Low differentiation, it's either too much or too little closeness, right? So that's both, low differentiation is both, either too much or too little, right? So, so when she wants to be close, he freaks out because it's too close. He goes further away, she freaks out because she's abandoned. And then it runs a cycle. She's abandoned. So what does she do? She tries to get close. So what does he do? He runs away. So you see how it runs a cycle. And then you look at the cycle, zoom out. Does it start to sound familiar? And you look at the cycle and you zoom out and you say, this is how they stay together. This is how they stay together. They can't do its regulation. Because that way, think of it, if simultaneously she were to be afraid of being abandoned and he would be afraid of being engulfed, it's an unsustainable moment. They're going to explode, right? So this way, one happens or the other. She's abandoned, he's engulfed, she's abandoned, he's engulfed, and it keeps running around. It saves them from a moment that they can't bear, where they're both face to face with their own fears. What's the cost of it? Like any regulation, the cost is that they can never be helping each other. Right? So if you recall, when we would say, Eleanor says, I try to talk to him, but he runs away. And you say to John, when you want to run away, what is it you're running away from? And he says, I'm running away from her. I said, well, just a moment. Here we get to your backstory, right? Who else have you run away from? This began when you were married? No, I had an engulfing mother. So I had this alcoholic mother. So all of that started before Eleanor, didn't it? Okay, so then you have your fear, right? There's something that comes at this particular part of the moment in life's story. It comes from Eleanor, but it doesn't really come from Eleanor. It comes from you. And do you think Eleanor could help you when you feel engulfed, right? Now, that's where the couples therapy starts. Could you help him when he's feeling engulfed? And they will run around because they'll, he'll say, she's causing it. I said, well, just a moment. 3 sessions later, we were starting to say that she's not the only cause of it. And so when you feel that, could you tell her I'm feeling engulfed instead of saying, you're engulfing me? How about trying that? right? And saying, could you help me? And Eleanor will say, how could I help you? I'm causing it. And they'll run around another 3 sessions. And then you finally get to the point where Eleanor says, well, what on earth would help you? Because, you know, when you're feeling engulfed, when I back away, then I feel abandoned. So if I could help you, I wouldn't feel abandoned, right? I could help you with your problem and wouldn't feel abandoned because I'm helping you. But what helps you? What on earth helps you? At which point, in my fantasized moment, John says, if you could just love me the way I am, because you hate this business of my feeling engulfed. And she says, no, I don't hate it. It's your problem. If I'm not causing it, I can understand that. You mean you can accept me even though I have a fear of being engulfed? She said, that's no problem. I've always felt that way. But why didn't you tell me? Because you didn't ask out with couples therapy. But the issue is that you allow her to help him with his problem, then you allow him to help her with her problem. And then the complementary cycle allows moments of co-creation, right? Where one helps the other with their fears. Okay, so that's where a couple always has a backstory, right?
Yeah, but it's interesting, this whole thing, because the couples always have a backstory, I agree. I think everyone probably has one, but to get to this level that you're talking about, like I'm feeling engulfed and I'm feeling overwhelmed, that's a level, I think, that just getting to there is very difficult with couples.
Right, that's why you have a couples therapy course now. And, but yeah,
Right.
of course it's difficult, but if you think about it, that's what they want. In other words, they're staying together not just to keep themselves miserable. They must have some sort of a hope that this could go somewhere. And then our goal is to try to revitalize the hope.
I think it's
Now,
also to take it one step at a time, like not to like reach too high of saying like, oh, they can say I feel enmeshed or I feel, you know, that you're taking me over, but just to move a little bit out of the cycle. Eventually they can possibly get there, or maybe not, but some movement.
But I guess the therapist has to recognize the cycle first.
You have to what?
It's the therapist's job to recognize the cycle, right? From the stories that they come and tell.
Exactly. In other words, if the therapist is saying, he's right, she's right, he's right, she's right, they're both right, right? But the therapist can say, you guys are stuck in a complementary cycle, and it's a tragedy for you, because it doesn't allow you ever moments of I-you, right? It's all I-it, it's all regulation. And so let me see if I can help you to get to a different kind of way. You don't say it that way, you say it to yourself. All of this course is about what you say to yourself. Supervision and clinical course is about what you say to your clients. We're talking about what you say to yourself. Okay, I see we're not going to get too far today. Yeah.
If a complementary cycle keeps regulation, then even if it is conflict, and it means that the conflict keeps
It's
them
right.
regulated.
There's a huge
So
conflict
There's a
here.
huge conflict, so
Right.
you call that conflict regulation.
The way the conflict is managed regulates the conflict. In other words,
Because regulation, you don't think goes together with the word conflict, but okay, I'm learning a lot.
no, exactly. That's a very useful point. Regulation doesn't mean smooth. It means sustainable. It means we can handle it. It doesn't mean you like it. And you know, there are people that are called the gruesome twosome, where they live together bashing each other. But something is regulated there, otherwise they wouldn't stay together, right?
So it's a system that's regulated, but it's both are suffering and in conflict.
Okay, so Risey is saying something better than I did. That's a good way to say it. The system is regulated. People aren't regulated, right? The system is regulated. People are in I-it. They're stuck doing the same old, and that regulates the relationship, right? Because the regulatory self-object is a relationship.
Going out of the conflict would be dysregulating for the system, even though it would be regulating for the
Exactly.
individual.
So when you say, you know, when he says she's always trying to swallow me, and you say, let's try to find out where this comes from and whether she could help you with it. That's a totally non-intuitive way of saying something. Yeah. What do you mean she could help me? She's the problem. She's not the solution. But that's our different way of looking at it. That's the way that we would say, the two of you are doing this, but there's a better way to do it. Yeah.
Is there other types of attachment besides abandonment and engulfment, other complementary cycles?
Yes. I think I mentioned to you that you can put a lot of emotional worlds into closeness, which is abandonment and engulfment, into self-respect, the self-esteem, and into power. So there are complementary cycles where people are controlling each other. John and Eleanor weren't controlling each other, right? Theirs was about closeness. There were complementary cycles about control, and there were complementary cycles about self-esteem, people putting each other down. They're not leaving each other, but they're putting each other down. So those three things will cover about 90% of what you have to deal with, and the other 10% you'll deal with later. But yeah, it's not just engulfment and...
Control, self-esteem, and...
What's that?
Oh, control, self-esteem,
Right.
and
closeness. Right. In the Hebrew, it's koach, kavod, and kirva. Koach, kavod, kirva. That's about 80% of what we deal with. And then you look at the cycle and you say which one isn't. That's an important correction. It's not always closeness. So then I think what we're going to do is stop here. And next time we're going to do an end run on triangles and minutiae and go straight into adolescence. So start doing the reading on adolescence. And for now that you all know what a complementary cycle is, go back. What we want you to do today is to finish the stories that you were working on, and then we're going to spend about 20 minutes in the small group trying to see what we learned about the exercise that we started last time. Everybody should have had the exercise. It was mailed to the people who weren't here, so you know what we're doing, right? Okay.